At the beginning of Boccaccio's Decameron, 10 young people fled Florence because of plague. That plague, better known as the Black Death, hangs like a baleful miasma over the second half of the 14th century. It had first appeared in Constantinople in the spring of 1347, brought almost certainly by ships escaping from the already plague ridden Genoese trading colony of Kaffa, now Feodosia in the Crimea, which was then under siege by the Mongols. The city had suffered many similar visitations over the centuries, but never one so virulent or on such a scale. The fatal bacillus was, as we now know, introduced by fleas, which were in turn usually, though not invariably, carried by the rats that infested all ships coming from the east. Curiously enough, these rats were themselves relatively new arrivals in Europe, the first of them having probably been brought in on ships carrying crusaders back from Palestine. But they were rapid and indefatigable breeders, and by mid century there were more than enough of them to propagate the disease throughout the European continent. We need not necessarily believe the anonymous contemporary chronicler from the Italian town of Este, who claims that in Constantinople plague accounted for 8/10 of the entire population. To the Byzantines, however, it must have seemed the final proof of what they have suspected for so long, that the Holy Virgin, their patron and protectress, had, after more than 1,000 years at last, deserted them. The Mediterranean proper had its first taste of the Black Death early in October 1347, when 12 Genoese galleys arrived in Messina. They too had probably come from Kaffa. It was certainly from there that yet another Genoese fleet was to transmit the infection in January 1348 to Genoa, Venice, and Sicily. From there, it spread north to Corsica and Sardinia, south to Tunis and North Africa, west to the Balearic Islands, and thence to Barcelona and Valencia on the Spanish coast, and inevitably across the straits to South Italy, whence its progress up the peninsula was swift. Of all the Italian cities, Florence suffered most. Contemporary assessments are famously unreliable, but there is good evidence to show that out of a total Florentine population estimated at some 95,000, between 50 and 60,000 were dead within 6 months of the outbreak. Boccaccio himself provides us with an unforgettable description. The headlong flight of whole populations from the cities and towns, abandoning their houses and possessions, the way in which the sick, even sick children, were left to their fate with no one daring to approach them, the mass burials in hurriedly dug trenches, the untended cattle wandering free through the countryside. In Venice, when the epidemic was at its height, 600 citizens a day were said to have perished. In Orvieto, out of every family of four, one of the parents and one of the children could statistically expect to die. In Siena, where the deaths were estimated at 50,000, two-thirds of the population, they were in the process of building the cathedral, which was to be one of the greatest in Christendom. The workmen all died. Construction was abandoned, and although activity was resumed towards the end of the century, the building has not to this day been completed as planned. As for Italy as a whole, to say that it lost a third or slightly more of its total population would probably not be very far wrong. In France, the story was much the same. The plague began, predictably enough, in Marseille. A few weeks later, It had reached the Pyrenees, and by August 1348 it was raging through Bordeaux. To the east, it struck Papal Avignon in March, killing at least half the population, including every single one of the English community of Austin Friars in the city. Pope Clement VI himself retired to his private apartments, where he received no one, and spent the entire day and night roasting himself between two blazing fires. The treatment proved successful. He survived. Meanwhile, the pestilence sped up the Rhone valley to Lyon, and by June was working its way through Paris itself. Wherever it struck, the more pious of the population withdrew to pray. Particularly in the major cities of the north, however, the predominant reaction to imminent death seems to have been a feverish and frenetic gaiety. And why not? If God had deserted his people, why should his commandments be obeyed? If their lives were to be so cruelly cut short, let their last days be devoted to pleasure, whether that of the table, the bottle, or the bed, or ideally all three. In Paris, where such delights have never been undervalued, there seems to have been what amounted to an almost complete breakdown in morality, both private and public. Across the length and breadth of the Mediterranean, the story was much the same. In Cyprus, where the onset of the plague coincided with a severe earthquake and tidal wave, it led to a panic stricken massacre by the landowners of all their Arab slaves for fear that they might take advantage of the prevailing chaos by staging a revolt. On the Dalmatian coast, the citizens of Salona, Split, had a different hazard to endure. Packs of ravening wolves descending on the city from the mountains and attacking both sick and survivors alike. Such was the mortality that piles of unburied corpses were left in the streets for weeks at a time. In Spain, having first appeared in the coastal cities, the plague moved slowly but persistently through the kingdom of Aragon. Its king, Pedro IV, somehow survived, but he lost first a daughter, then a niece, and finally in October his second wife, Eleanor of Portugal. The scourge then spread, first to the Muslim lands and thence to the army of Castile, at that time engaged in a vigorous campaign of reconquest in the south under the leadership of King Alfonso XI himself. In 1344 he had taken Algeciras. He was now before Gibraltar. The besiegers of the rock, unlike its defenders, remained unaffected throughout the summer of 1349. But early in March 1350, the dread sickness struck. Alfonso's generals implored him to withdraw into isolation until it should have run its course, but he refused to leave his men. He died on Good Friday, 26 March, the only ruling monarch to fall victim to the Black Death. Joanna, daughter of Edward III of England, died at Bordeaux on the way to her wedding with Alfonso's son, Pedro the Cruel. The territory of Castile itself, though it did not escape entirely, certainly got off lightly, thanks, it was widely believed at the time, to the eagerness of the land-owning classes to make over their property to the church. When the emergency was passed, it was found that they had done so on such a scale as seriously to upset the economic balance of the country. In 1351, King Pedro I was obliged to order the ecclesiastical authorities to make full restitution of all that they had received. The Black Death took a greater toll of life than any known war or epidemic in previous history. Its effects on international trade was dramatic, but relatively short lived. More lasting was the alarming reduction of the amount of land under cultivation, to the deaths owing to the deaths of so many laborers. This compelled the landowners drastically to increase wages, which in turn brought a weakening of the formerly rigid stratification of society as the working people began, for the first time, to travel about in search of employment or higher pay.